First, I want to praise President Obama and Secretary Kerry for trying to have a diplomatic approach. We all know diplomacy is preferred to war, as Winston Churchill, who certainly understood the risks of diplomatic resolutions of the kind that Chamberlain accepted, but Churchill said war, jaw is better than war. We all understand that. And if we look at the Syrian situation, the Obama administration, quite by accident, backed itself into a wonderful resolution where the Syrians are giving up their chemical weapons without a shot having been fired. I think everybody in this room would agree that the goal of our approach, the United States approach, Israel's approach, would be, if it's possible, to bring about a cessation of Iran's nuclear weapons program, which of course they are undertaking, without a shot having to be fired, and even without sanctions, if the end result would be to bring Iran into the international community, to have them end their support for Hezbollah, to stop them from being a rogue nation, and to bring them back to a situation where the international community accepts them. That would be the perfect solution. I think there's about a 10% chance of that happening. President Obama thinks there's a 50-50 chance. I'm not sure he thinks that, but certainly that's been his public position. The one thing we know for absolute certain is that we know nothing for absolute certain about Iran's state of mind. We are guessing. We don't know whether or not the supreme leader of Iran has put Iran in the front with a nice smiling face in order to conceal from the world his intentions, which haven't changed, that is to develop nuclear weapons aimed at Israel, to create a nuclear umbrella under which terrorism can operate, to hang a sort of Damocles over Israel, to encourage Yerida, many people leaving Israel for fear of a nuclear possible attack. Do I think that's the most likely scenario? Yes, I do. There are two other possible scenarios. One, maybe there are pressures within Iran and the supreme leader has changed his mind and understood that the United States and Israel have given him two options. Number one, end the nuclear program, or number two, lose your regime. And he thought that he'd prefer not to lose his regime, and so he's changed his mind. Possibility, I put that at about 1%. Then I think there's another possibility, namely that there's an internal struggle going on. Unlikely in Iran, we haven't seen that before, but the Revolutionary Guard seems to be critical of the deal, and there are some elements within Iran that are favorable. We do know that although elections aren't real in Iran, there was some popular uprising in the street, and maybe there is a process going on, and the issue then would be how best to influence that process in the right direction, whether by maintaining the sanctions, increasing the sanctions, maintaining a credible military threat, is better than making a deal of the kind that was made. My own view is that maintaining the military option and keeping the sanctions was a better way of influencing that outcome than the deal we have now made. I think Iran has gotten what they want from the deal. What they have gotten in their mind, they may be wrong about it, but in their mind, is the beginning of the end of the sanctions process. They're going to be relieved of somewhere between $8 and $22 million of immediate sanctions, but China is already there in Tehran seeking business. Other countries are there seeking business. They see the end of the sanction regime. The words may not be that, but the music is clearly in that direction. What have they had to give up in exchange? They haven't had to give up their building of rockets, which are capable of carrying nuclear weapons. And you might ask the question, why are you developing rockets capable of carrying nuclear weapons if you deny having a nuclear weapons program? Number one. Number two, there has been no slowing down of the building of centrifuges and the spinning and the ability to develop a civilian capacity which is easily transferable to a military capacity, and no ceasing of the heavy water plant and process. So the Iranians see this as a victory. That's very, very clear. And I think the difference is not between American and Israeli intelligence assessments. I think the intelligence assessments are essentially the same. I think the big difference is America is many thousands of miles away, is not at immediate risk. Therefore, it can place hope over fear. Israel, which is so close and is the intended target of any nuclear program, has to place fear over hope. And so there are reasonable differences. In my autobiography, I write that where one stands is a function of where one sat and who one sat next to. And I would add to that, how one stands on the threat of a nuclear program is a function of where one sits in relation to where the threat is. So I think we see a reasonable disagreement. Having said that, I think it was a mistake. I think it was a serious mistake. It has a potential for success, but the potential for failure is greater than the potential for success. We should stop looking backward and start looking forward and see what the United States and Israel can do together over the next 6 months to increase the possibility of a good deal. After all, one of Iran's goals, one of the very important Iran's goals, was to create a gulf between Israel and the United States, or to increase the gulf. They have succeeded in that direction. They have succeeded for a lot of reasons. There's been a lot of public criticism by Israel. By the way, the White House appreciates some of that. I think there is an understanding in the White House that good cop, bad cop, Israel being very, very tough, being critical of the United States, probably helps the United States in its negotiating posture, but the question is one of degree. And so I think right now the issue is how to narrow the gulf, how to get the least worst deal as a end of 6 months, and what to do in the very likely event that at the end of 6 months there will be no deal. My great fear, and then I'll stop, my great fear is that the Obama administration may have a different goal than Israel long term. And that is, the Obama administration might be satisfied by kicking the can for the next 3 years. That is, by making sure that Iran doesn't develop a nuclear weapon on President Obama's watch. I sat next to President Obama as close as I'm sitting to you, and he looked me in the eye and he said, "Alan, you know me. You've known me for a long time. I don't bluff. I am telling you, looking you in the eye, Iran will not develop a nuclear bomb on my watch. I have Israel's back." And he was very clear about that, and I was very clear in saying, "Mr. President, as you sit here now looking at me, I believe you. You're telling me the truth. You're telling me what you believe now. But I don't know what you will believe in a year or 2 years when Iran gets close and the decision has to be made. Who knows what sabers will be rattled by China or by Russia or by Congress? You're not in a position to keep that promise. And that's why you can't ask Israel to outsource the defense of its civilians to another country." And I reminded him, as I have in print, of Elie Wiesel's famous lesson from the Shoah: always believe the threats of your enemies over the promises of your friends. And that's why Israel must always maintain an independent capacity to take whatever action is necessary. Now, I know we have in the audience one of my heroes, the former head of the Mossad, Mr. Halevi, who I admire enormously, and he has said publicly that he thinks that it would be a mistake for Israel to unilaterally, I hope I have you correct, unilaterally take a decision at the point you made that statement, it was a while ago, to take military action. But I think he has also said publicly that keeping the military option on the table, particularly a joint military option with the United States and with Israel, is essential. I support that view, and we all hope that the military option doesn't have to be deployed. Right now, Iran does not believe there is a military option. Right now, Iran's state of mind is that America will not employ the military option, that Israel needs a green light from the United States to deploy it, and that Israel will not get that green light. I think they are wrong in the latter assessment. I don't believe Israel thinks it needs a green light from the United States. I think people who think that will be very surprised if it becomes necessary. That doesn't mean I think the military option will be deployed. But the next year is going to be a crucial year in the history of American-Israel relations, in the history of Israel, in the history of Israel's relations with Iran. We're going to see an end, we haven't talked about this yet, of the 9-month pregnancy process of the peace talks with Tzipi Livni leading the peace talks. We're going to see the expiration of the 6-month period, which may end in an abortion, and a late-term abortion, which is always very unhealthy. And none of us can predict, as we sit here today, what the outcomes of those two very important processes are and how they are, if any way, linked together. I urge the State of Israel not to base its decision on existing international law. As Dean Acheson once said, no country's survival has ever been made to depend on international law. International law in this regard is anachronistic. It's out of date. It was never viable. Let me give you an example. If Winston Churchill had made the decision in 1937 to attack Nazi Germany because they were building up an arms system capable of destroying all of Europe, they would have been in violation of international law, and it would have been the right thing to do. And the United States, when it had mutually assured destruction with the Soviet Union as its Cold War goal, you attack New York, we'll attack Moscow, was in clear violation of international law. You're not allowed to bomb civilian targets in retaliation for the bombing of your civilian targets. International law, with all due respect to Penina, is a construct in the mind of a bunch of left-wing academics. There is no basis for international law in any reality. It's not based on legislation. Much of it is not based on treaty. It is the ultimate exercise in elitist non-democracy. And if it makes sense, then it should be followed. The Israeli Supreme Court has done a very good job in bringing it into a realistic sense. The two decisions, one of which referred to by Justice Rose, was the decision about the security fence. That was a application of international law contextually to a realistic situation. The decision about targeted killing by Justice Barak, likewise. But if you applied literal international law to either of those problems, literal international law, you'd get to an extremely unjust result. How do you go about making decisions of this kind? It's very, very complex. Let me give you an example again to go back to Winston Churchill. We know Winston Churchill favored diplomacy. We know he would not have given up the Sudetenland for peace in our time. We don't know whether he would have actually attacked if he had been prime minister. But if he had been the prime minister and had attacked, as Goebbels thought he would in his diaries, and had killed the entire Nazi regime, destroyed the entire Nazi party, and in the process killed 10,000 innocent German civilians, he would go down in history as a butcher, a barbarian, and the paradigm of the violation of international law, and yet he would have saved 50 million lives. But nobody would have known that. Why? Because history is blind, deaf, and dumb. It doesn't understand contingencies. It doesn't understand the future. It doesn't understand what would happen if Israel were to, or the United States were to have to take the decision as a last resort to destroy Iran's nuclear weapons. Nobody could know what it would have prevented. That's not a case or an argument for doing it. It's an argument for Penina continuing her research on international law, for writing the best possible brief. And by the way, I have urged the Israeli government now, not a year from now, not 2 years from now, or to international scholars, to prepare a brilliant, creative brief showing how international law has changed. Remember, too, that the Security Council Article 51 wouldn't even have permitted Israel to attack in 1967 preemptively. As the result of Israel's attack in 1967 and other factors, the UN appointed a commission to relook at Charter 51, and they said preemptive wars are justified under international law in violation of the language of the Charter article. They said as to preventive wars, it's a very hard question, and it is a hard question. But if it comes to nuclear weapons and your survival, at least you can make the case for it. Now, the argument that international law would prohibit an attack because they don't yet have a bomb shows the absurdity of international law. It shows the stupidity of international law in not recognizing that you cannot attack a government once it has a nuclear bomb. Look at North Korea. Look at Pakistan. You must attack, if you're going to attack, a nuclear weapons program before the nuclear weapon is developed. Otherwise, you'll cause enormous environmental damage. And international law doesn't recognize that because of who wrote it. And that's why I think, realistically, all the other factors that you've taken into account must be considered. But I cannot imagine any rational government making a decision on its own survival based on a bunch of academics sitting in the Sorbonne deciding in ivory towers what international law should be in a society of perfect beings that if men were angels and women were angels, we would exist. And that's not the way international law works today.